In Japanese historiography, there are eras associated with the emperor in charge. Currently, the era of Japan under Emperor Naruhito is the Reiwa era. There is a lot of poetic context to the naming of eras, but in English you could summarize the meaning as beautiful harmony. It's not the translation, but it is the explanation, according to the Foreign Ministry. In any case, you could compare this to things like the Victorian era in British history. Monarchs can be around for a long time and as a result can represent multiple generations. The era between 1926 and 1989 under Emperor Hirohito, yes, that one, was known as the Showa Era, which can roughly be approximated as, enlightened peace. That's, ironic, but I suppose at least for after World War II this sort of fits. Japan is no longer at war, and America stops occupying Japan in 1952, which begins to have unprecedented economic growth. Japan managed to become the world's second largest economy within 2 decades, which is known as the Japanese economic miracle. So, by the end of the Showa era, you have 3 decades of peace, prosperity, and growth. This meant that in Japanese politics, things were also really stable. Japan had, and debatably still has, what people call a 1.5-party system. In 1955, the Liberal Democratic Party formed as a general center-right party. The LDP would always get 40 to 50% of the vote, and therefore a majority of the seats. Then the rest was divided between multiple smaller parties. This meant the LDP won first place in every general election of the Showa era after 1955. The main opposition was the Japanese Socialist Party, a left-wing party that formed in 1945 and under American occupation actually held a brief government between 1947 and 1948. But then in 1951, they briefly split into the left and right socialist parties until reunifying in 1955 to compete with the LDP. However, in a classic unsurprising Cold War turn of events, America not wanting a strong socialist party in Japan interfered a little bit and the party splintered, resulting in the breakaway Democratic Socialist Party of Japan in 1960 taking a more moderate center-left. Then of course you had to have a separate Japanese Communist Party as well, who thought the socialists and the Dem Socs might as well be the same. Classic infighting. As a result, there were several times the Socialist Party made a strong opposition, but they never got first place and they never got to form government for the rest of the Showa era. But leftist infighting wasn't the only reason. Not only did the Japanese economy remain prosperous, but the LDP was good at altering its positions to those agreeable with the general public. But no political domination lasts forever, and eventually anyone in power that long begins to grow complacent. Just as the Showa era would come to an end and become the Heisei era, Japanese politics would also have a shift, resulting in one of the most fascinating time periods in Japanese politics. By the late 1980s, the 4 major parties had grown to include more, including the Komeito Party, the Progressives, and finally the Socialist Democrats. Not to be confused with the Democratic Socialists, different party. None of them had a chance of taking power away from the LDP, but the LDP would begin to show some cracks. In 1985, the Japanese yen began to undergo appreciation. Basically, the currency was too high in value, which hurt their economy due to their reliance on exports. As a result, Japan experienced a minor recession and the beginning of an asset price bubble. One of the ways they tried to fix this was by introducing a 3% consumption tax, which was very unpopular with the public. Then to make matters even worse, a scandal arose in 1988 which involved Japanese Prime Minister Noboru Takeshita and several other LDP party members to resign after being caught benefiting from insider trading. Other politicians and most of the other parties were also implicated, but for the LDP, their lion's share of the controversy ended up being the final straw. Emperor Hirohito died on January 7, 1989, ending the Showa era. As the Heisei era began with the ascension of Emperor Akihito, so began the new era in Japanese politics. In 1989, an election for the National Diet's upper house, called the House of Councillors, took place. Half of its 252 seats were up for re-election, and for the first time in the party's history, the LDP lost both the popular vote and the majority. While the LDP still ruled the House of Councillors with a minority government, Prime Minister Sosuke Uno resigned over the results, having only been in office for 2 months. As the LDP seemed to keep stumbling, the events of 1989 proved that these political gods could bleed. However, a temporary bandage occurred when the LDP still managed to retain a majority in the lower house elections in 1990. LDP Prime Minister Toshiki Kaifu, compared to his predecessors at least, had a cleaner image and seemed interested in reform. With this victory, the LDP had a chance to reassure its voting base. However, while Kaifu was able to make some contributions to foreign affairs, he was never able to get any electoral reforms passed. The Japanese public may have wanted political reform, but the reformist faction within the LDP was much smaller. The death knell of the Kaifu government was the emergence of yet another corruption scandal in 1991, this time involving transportation and logistics company Sagawa Express over illegal financial guarantees from government officials. Prime Minister Kaifu resigned in November of that year, having been in office for 2 years and 2 months. Next in office for the LDP was Kiichi Miyazawa. Miyazawa had been involved in Japanese politics in some form since 1942. Yes, as a matter of fact, he was working in the financial department under Tojo's government, and then 50 years later, he's finally at the top. Remember that scandal from back in 1988? Well, he was one of the participants involved, and he resigned his cabinet position over it, so the question is, would the corrupt politician who resigned over it but got rewarded with the prime ministry be the man to pass political reform? No. But to give Miyazawa a little bit of credit, there were some financial reforms passed, but nothing to satisfy what the Japanese public really wanted. Although just a couple of months into his office, he had the supreme honor of being vomited upon by US President George H.W. Bush at a state dinner, so there's that. Fun fact, this became such a meme at the time in Japan that the term bushusuru, or bushing it, became a phrase. But perhaps the most interesting thing politically to happen with the Miyazawa government was their acknowledgement of comfort women during World War II. In 1992, Miyazawa made a formal apology in South Korea about Japan abducting many Korean women into forced prostitution as so-called comfort women. The Japanese government had rather famously been very reluctant and non-committal to acknowledging atrocities and war crimes they committed during the war, and for many conservative politicians within the LDP, there was even active hostility at the idea of Japan admitting any wrongdoing during that time period. So this apology, even if 50 years too late, was a surprisingly big deal and controversial. Between not satisfying the voting public and deepening rifts between factions within the LDP, Miyazawa wasn't in a good position. In 1992, a group of reform-minded LDP members broke off the party to form the Japan New Party. The 1992 upper house election resulted in the LDP still not having a majority, but the new party did earn a few seats, and the traditional opposition of the Socialist Party won more seats. Then in 1993, another splinter group from the LDP formed the New Party Sakigake, which translates rather epically to the New Harbinger Party. That same year, yet another breakaway party formed called the Japan Renewal Party. While the next lower house election would have likely been in 1993 regardless, everyone made Miyazawa's unpopularity very clear. On June 18, 1983, a motion of no confidence was passed. It was time for another lower house election. As the 1993 election was approaching, the opposition realized they had an opportunity on their hands. Statistically speaking, this was literally a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the LDP to no longer control both chambers of the National Diet. Aside from the Socialist Party seeming to be on the upswing, the new party was also experiencing large growth and support. They got their foot in the door of the upper house election, maybe now they could take it entirely. What about the other new reformist party members? July 18th, just a month after the vote of no confidence, Japanese citizens took to the polling stations. Voter turnout was actually down by 6.32%, but the opposition was hoping for the LDP to lose their majority of seats. The magic number was 256 for a majority. The results? The LDP still took first place with 36.6% of the popular vote, but it only resulted in 223 seats. The first step of ending LDP power was a success. However, the traditional opposition of the Socialist Party had a similar decline, dropping all the way down to only 70 seats with 15.4% of the vote. Third place was the Japan Renewal Party, earning 55 seats, followed by Komeito with 51 seats and the New Party with 35 seats. The three other left-wing parties had a similar showing with their small amount of seats, and the NP Sakigake Party earned 13 seats. While the LDP lost its majority, there was a chance that the LDP could coalition with a minor party, but no one believed the LDP would be willing to implement reforms, and frankly they all just hated the LDP for always winning anyway. Despite the opposition parties being across most of the political spectrum, they had two things in common. They wanted reform, and they hated the LDP, so the unthinkable happened. all of the opposition parties, well, all of them except for the communists, made a grand coalition so they could form government. To emphasize their cooperation and dedication to electoral reform, the leader of the Japan New Party, Morihiro Hosokawa, was chosen as prime minister. For the first time in 38 years, the LDP was out of government. In one of the final acts of the now outgoing Miyazawa government, his chief cabinet secretary Yohei Kono on August 4th announced the results of a government study on the usage of comfort women during World War II. In a statement that would simply be dubbed the Kono Statement, Kono acknowledged the usage of comfort women by the Japanese military during World War II. But Kono also slightly shifted the blame by mostly blaming third-party private recruiters. Obviously, this was an extremely limited acknowledgement, and not even anything resembling an apology, but it upset conservative factions within the LDP anyway, and would continue to do so for decades. Notably, future Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2007 would deny that anything forceful took place, although when he reopened the research into this matter in 2015, he ultimately decided not to alter the Kono Statement and just quietly moved on. The new Prime Minister Hosokawa intended to implement several political reforms, but despite his coalition having a majority, the level of reform was still debated. As a result, compromises were made. Instead of eliminating corporate donations altogether, they were merely capped. Instead of radically redrawing the electorate map, he kept the changes pretty minor. But in early 1994, the biggest change was the changing of the voting system. Japan since World War II had a single non-transferable voting system with multi-member districts. Basically, if a constituency had 3 elected members, first, second, and third place would be elected. Now, with these reforms, there would be a mixed electoral system. 300 of the lower house seats would be single first-past-the-post districts, while 200 would be proportionally distributed among the parties based on the popular vote within different regions of the country. While this new system had its flaws like any other, it was definitely an improvement. Nevertheless, the Hosokawa government compromising on other reforms resulted in his popularity decreasing. He also raised the hated consumption tax from 3% to 7% starting in 1997, but rescinded it the next day after the resulting outrage. Then just a few months later, Hosokawa was exposed for taking a 100 million yen bribe from Japanese truckers, but specifically Japanese truckers associated with past accusations of bribery. Hosokawa's defense was that it was just a loan and that he had supposedly already paid it back. But nevertheless, this was a complete blow to the image the coalition was standing for, and Hosokawa resigned on April 28, 1994, having been in office for just under 9 months. The party leader of the Japan Renewal Party, Tsutomu Hata, became prime minister, but his government would be even shorter. The completion of the electoral forms mixed with the sudden corruption shook up the coalition. With the new party disgraced, it would logically have made sense for the second-place Socialist Party to have the most influence in the new cabinet. But then 5 parties formed a coalition within the coalition called the Kaishin Group to undercut the Socialist Party's influence on the cabinet. The Socialist Party, naturally feeling betrayed, just left the coalition, removing the coalition's majority. Hata took responsibility for the coalition's collapse, resigning on June 30th after just 2 months in office. Now, no party or coalition had a clear majority. It was time to pick a prime minister and no one knew what would happen. Remember Yohei Kono, the LDP cabinet member who made the Kono Statement on Japanese comfort women? Well, Kono was the LDP leader now, and Kono, being sympathetic to some reform, saw this as an opportunity to rehabilitate the LDP's image. He approached the leader of the Socialist Party, Tomichi Murayama, about the possibility of a different grand coalition, this time between the LDP and Socialist Party. Naturally, more conservative factions of the LDP were not interested and didn't want to even entertain the idea of putting their natural rivals in office. Former LDP Prime Minister Toshiki Kaifu announced his intentions to return to office. You know, the one that resigned after another corruption scandal in 1991. The first round of voting had no clear winner. Murayama was 15 votes short, while Kaifu was 36 votes short. After a second round of voting between just Kaifu and Murayama, Murayama got the position with 261 votes. For the first time since 1948, the Socialist Party of Japan would have the top job, even if under a coalition between the Socialists, LDP, and the new Harbinger Party. Now, admittedly, like most left-wing parties after the Cold War, the party was a bit more moderate than before, which made the coalition a bit more digestible, but that did not mean they got along. Natural friction between Murayama and the conservative members of the LDP and the business world meant very little things would get done without general consensus. The Japanese-US Security Treaty was renewed, preventing Japanese full remilitarization. The previously passed electoral reform would remain in place for the 1996 elections. However, towards the end of 1994, the parties of the Kaishin coalition megazorded themselves into a new party called the New Frontier Party, making Toshiki Kaifu their leader. Then on January 17, 1995, the tragedy known as the Great Hanshin Earthquake occurred. It would be the second deadliest earthquake in 20th century Japan, and the government's disaster teams were caught off guard. While this became a wake-up call for further reforms in earthquake proofing and disaster relief, it didn't help the coalition's image. In July, the upper house of the Diet had its next election. The LDP actually gained seats while the Socialist Party nearly halved its seats. The New Frontier Party won the popular vote and gained 68 seats, showing that they were certainly here to stay. The Grand Coalition, however, still had the majority. Nevertheless, it was clear that the Socialist Party likely wasn't going to be growing anytime soon. The LDP was back on the upswing, and the New Frontier was quickly taking the mantle of the strongest opposition party. Prime Minister Murayama knew his time in office would be short. August 15th of 1995 was the 50th anniversary of Japan's surrender and the end of World War II. Murayama, being in his mid-70s, had been a socialist since before World War II, making him one of the few Japanese politicians to have no problem openly pointing out the atrocities committed by the fascist wartime military government of Japan during the war. As Prime Minister, he would also naturally be expected to make a statement on the 50th anniversary. You can imagine the conservative factions of the LDP were not happy at the idea of Murayama even thinking about doing more than the bare minimum. However, Murayama remained firm on the matter, stating if he couldn't make this statement as Prime Minister, what was even the point of giving him the job? Murayama then threatened to resign, and after so many unpleasant resignations in a row, the opposing cabinet members reluctantly gave in. On August 15, 1995, Prime Minister Murayama released what would become the Murayama Statement. In this 7-paragraph statement, most of it discussed his happiness that Japan had built itself back up since the devastation of the war, and that Japan had remained a peaceful nation. The 5th paragraph went as followed. During a certain period in the not-too-distant past, Japan, following a mistaken national policy, advanced along the road to war, only to ensnare the Japanese people in a fateful crisis, and through its colonial rule and aggression, caused tremendous damage and suffering to the people of many countries, particularly to those of Asian nations. In the hope that no such mistake be made in the future, I regard, in a spirit of humility, these irrefutable facts of history and express here once again my feelings of deep remorse and state my heartfelt apology. Allow me also to express my feelings of profound mourning for all victims, both at home and abroad, of that history. He then concluded by urging the elimination of self-righteous nationalism, promoting democracy, eliminating nuclear weapons, and endorsing international cooperation. Like with the Kono statement 2 years prior, this apology was obviously long overdue and hardly anything concrete in terms of restitution to any remaining victims or their families. Yet this statement was more than the Japanese had ever acknowledged to that point. While South Korea treated it with skepticism, China took it a bit more warmly. Murayama is still alive, having recently turned 100 years old, and well after his time in office he constantly would visit China to promote efforts of reconciliation, to the point of Chinese media referring to him as a good friend of the Chinese people. Murayama, however, thought he was simply stating the obvious, and there wasn't even any certainty that the future governments would echo the statement. Murayama would rebrand the Socialist Party of Japan to the Social Democratic Party in early 1996. In October of 1996, the election saw the Social Democratic Party continue their collapse, with the New Frontier Party taking 156 seats and a new Democratic Party taking 52 seats. Amusingly, the Communist Party actually rose in seats, probably from disappointed socialists at the party's moderation. However, the LDP still lacked a majority, which meant the previous coalition would actually continue for the next term. The New Frontier Party would end up collapsing in 1997, leading to the Democratic Party becoming the main opposition. After all of the chaos of the previous decade, Japan had advanced from a 1.5 party system to a 2-ish party system, with the LDP still being the dominant party. Oh well. It was truly a new era of Japanese politics. Hey everyone, I was recently approached by the Pacific Atrocities Education Group to make them a map video summarizing the rise and fall of Imperial Japan's military expansion. It'll be used to support their upcoming event in San Francisco on September 18th, where there will be discussions on wartime atrocities and include speakers that lived through some of the events. They were kind enough to buy me a plane flight over to attend the event, so it'd be great if you supported their new YouTube channel by giving a video a watch and a like. We'd both appreciate it. Thank you for watching.